Right here in front of me is a camera who holds a special place in the history of video capturing devices. Before we had digital sensors, we had film. Everyone knows what film is, and people to this day still swear that film is the absolute best when it comes to image quality. Mostly I would agree with that, but I would say how expensive it is to film with film. It's just kind of out of the reach for most people. Jumping ahead, what we have now for almost everything. It's in your cell phone, it's in your webcam, and it's even in beloved Hollywood movie-making cameras like the Arri Alexa, the digital sensor. However, almost all video cameras or video capturing devices that you're going to interact with is going to be a CMOS sensor. But that wasn't always the case. In fact, when we first got into digital sensors, we had something called a CCD sensor. Now, there's better channels out there that will get really nerdy about this. My goal isn't to describe all the technology, but more give you an understanding of why this camera is special. Now, this camera has what's called a 3 CCD sensor. And what's interesting about it is that it actually has 3 sensors, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. And the light going in from the lens hits a prism and splits the image into the respective color wavelengths, and then it goes to the respective sensor so that it can read each of those color channels independently. Now, the reason why this camera is so special is because before, those digital sensors were recording to a magnetic tape cassette. Ugh, that's a word, magnetic tape. In fact, the older brother of this, the HVX 200, had a mini DV tape deck on the side right here. But in addition to the tape deck, the HVX 200 had something that was pretty interesting. It had a digital storage device in the form of a P2 card. Now, these things were really expensive back in the day, and the largest one that you could actually get was 8 gigabytes, which would last you maybe 5 minutes of shooting. You had 2 slots, so you could have 2 of them, but still, that's not quite good enough. So I think that's really why most people didn't really know what to do with the P2 cards in the beginning. But then, a couple years later, they came out with the HPX 170, or over here, the 173MC. And that just did away completely with the tape deck. Saved yourself a lot of weight, and you just used the P2 cards. And thankfully, around that time, storage technology improved, and so I have here 2 64 gigabyte cards, which gives me more than enough shooting time for pretty much the whole day. But I digress. The reason why this is so important for me is because I am in love with the 3 CCD sensor. There's such a richness of color to it, and yet you still get that nostalgic vibe. It's just so wonderful. And an added bonus is that you can actually shoot 720p on this thing, which, trust me, is higher than most of those handycams out there. And it has SDI, and you can get 10-bit color out with the SDI, which is just fantastic if you're going to be using it for live streaming. In fact, a lot of my channel has been using this as my A cam whenever I'm doing bench work because I could zoom in and zoom out, and it looked fantastic. But the real reason why this camera in particular is so good is because of those P2 cards. Unless you have some sort of special dedicated FireWire recorder, you really can't get the footage off of an old Handycam that shoots on a 3 CCD like the TRV 900 or the VX 1000 without losing so much of the quality in converting it from the mini DV tapes over to something that you can actually edit on a computer. Now, if you have an old Mac that has a FireWire port, you might have a little bit of luck, but that's just a whole thing and a whole hassle, and really the best way to deal with that is to get, like, I think it's called the Sony MRV1, I don't know, it's a Sony recorder that records by FireWire, but that's actually also very expensive, something like $300. But you can throw all of that away because this camera has the perfect balance between modern usability and that vintage feel of the 3 CCD. Internal NDs, pretty darn good autofocused, like a lens that's just incredibly sharp and beautiful. XLR ports, phantom power, I mean, this thing has everything you need. It really was made for professional broadcasting. But then I met a guy called Nick Gregorio, and we became fast friends. But in our conversation, I learned that he shot Harris Malden with the HVX 200.
You fake your mustache!
I was so ecstatic because I had the younger brother and I was eager to show him, but then he started talking about something called a red rock adapter, and I was like, what the heck is that? Well, here we are after rabbit hole, and then one stroke of luck, we have the red rock adapter right in front of us. The Red Rock adapter is a spinning ground glass adapter. What is that? Well, basically, what happens is the light goes into the lens that you put on the front. This is the EF mount. It hits a piece of ground glass. On one side, it's frosted glass. On the other side, it's clear. The image gets projected onto that frosted glass, and it's spinning, by the way. You have to turn this switch on to spin it so that you don't see the individual grains, and it's really distracting. It'll kind of smooth everything out. You won't see the grain of the glass. But then you're actually filming the backside of that glass to get the image. The reason why you're doing that is because you're able to get depth of field and a full frame depth of field, by the way. Back then, there wasn't really any full frame video cameras that you could record with as professionally as the HPX or HVX. So that's why this ground glass adapter was so game breaking, because you could basically get that full frame depth of field film look that you could only get with film cameras that were incredibly expensive, but now you could do it with your pretty relatively cheap Handycam. Now, I saw this on a secondhand store, and it didn't come with the achromatic diopter in the front, which, as I was learning more and more about, I realized that in order to have the camera this close to the glass, you have to get a diopter so you can focus closer. But it has to be an achromatic diopter, otherwise you'll have a lot of edge distortion. Now, I got a +10, which has a little bit of edge distortion, but it's not distracting, and I kind of like it. It kind of adds to the vintage vibe and really draws the eye into the center of the frame. Other than that, it was a lot of 3D printing and a lot of designing to get this thing exactly the way I wanted it. I put a brace here on the front to really lock this thing down so that it wouldn't be jiggling around, and you can kind of carry it around with without worrying about the carbon fiber rods bending or something like that. I use carbon fiber rods because I wanted it to be as light as humanly possible. And in the beginning, I actually didn't have this monitor on the top, but I found it was just way too hard to pull focus with this thing in the tiny little screen, mostly due to the fact that the image is inverted and upside down. And that's because that's just how it works in a lens. Now, with the HPX 173, you can actually flip that image, but you lose all of the menu and things like that, so then you can't really see with the focus peaking or something. And that's why I have this up here, because not only is it a bigger screen, but I can use focus peaking here, and then I just turn the histogram on down over here, and I'm good to go. I had to do a lot of little tiny things like lock down this focusing wheel in the front, because if you even bumped it a little bit, it would screw up the focus. You should be focusing with the lens, not with the HPX 173's lens. That should be focused on the glass and then just stays there. So I did rig this up so that it could be shoulder mounted with the little handle here, but to be honest, I think the shoulder mounting is just a little bit too unwieldy for me. I'm not used to shoulder mounting cameras, so I usually just put my leg out, rest it on my leg, and kind of do that. Given how heavy this is, you don't have to worry so much about micro jitters. You get pretty smooth footage, unless you're using something like a Canon 200mm, which I tried, and that was really tough to film with. But I had a job shooting a dance troupe, and I decided to take this thing out there and see what I can get. And I was pretty blown away with just how beautiful this thing is. I mean, you gotta remember how old this camera is. Of course, it's not gonna hold up to the resolution of my C70. It's a dual gain sensor, 4K sensor. You know, this thing's 720p, but it's still pretty mind-blowing how a camera this old can hold its own with something that's modern, and even having a certain vibe to it that you can't get with a filter. I mean, you could do your best to apply filters to modern-day cameras to try to make it look like this, but it's really tough. It's actually much better for you just to go out there, purchase one of these if you're really into vintage filmmaking, and there you go. I think for anyone who has a real strong drive to shoot nostalgic videos, this thing was just an absolute dream. I made it as light and streamlined as possible. When you have a V-mount battery in the back, it's pretty well balanced, so even though it's a little bit heavy, it's not unwieldy. I am gonna be selling it mostly because I've got way too much stuff in my studio, and I already have cameras that I need to be filming with and professional jobs, so this thing would just sit on the shelf. I'll probably sell it locally, but if you're super interested in filming with this and not just putting it on your shelf, then go ahead and shoot me a message, and I might be interested in shipping it out to you, because I really would like to see this thing in use rather than just sitting on a shelf in some collection. This thing is an absolute beaut, and if you shoot nostalgia, it'll deliver.